My name is Hannah Mitchell, and last month I flew from Portland to Denver for my parents' wedding vow renewal. In my arms was a leather-bound photo album I had spent weeks creating, hoping it would be a bridge back to the family I thought I still had. For a brief moment, as the music drifted through the garden and the air smelled of fresh roses, I let myself believe this could be the day we began again. But halfway down the path, my sister stepped into my way, her smile tight, and said, "You are not family anymore." My mother stood beside her, silent, and in that silence something in me shifted. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply decided this would not be the story they got to write for me. Ethan walked beside me, his hand brushing mine every so often, steady and reassuring. We had flown in from Portland that morning, and the moment I saw the elegant setup, part of me wanted to believe this was the right choice. My parents, Richard and Evelyn Mitchell, were renewing their vows after years apart. It was supposed to be a symbol of love and second chances. Maybe I thought this could be one for me too. A chance to feel like part of the family again. The scent of roses hung heavy in the air as we stepped onto the cobblestone path leading toward the reception area. Laughter floated from clusters of people under the white canopy. I recognized old business partners of my parents' neighbors from when I was a kid, even a few faces I hadn't seen since high school. I drew in a deep breath, lifting the album slightly in my arms. It had taken weeks to put together, each page filled with moments from our family's history, from grainy Polaroids of camping trips to glossy prints of birthdays and graduations. I wanted them to see that no matter what had happened, I still remembered us as we were. We were almost to the entry when a sudden shadow fell across the path. Caroline stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, her champagne glass glinting in the light. She wore a fitted navy dress and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Before I could greet her, her voice rang out sharp and clear enough to cut through the chatter. "You are not family anymore." It hit like a slap, the words carrying just far enough that heads began to turn. Conversations faltered, and I caught the flicker of surprise on a few faces before they smoothed over into polite curiosity. My steps froze, the album pressing against my ribs as my mind scrambled to catch up with what she had just said. Caroline stood with perfect posture, her chin lifted, watching me like she had been waiting for this moment. Her free hand rested on her hip, nails painted a deep red that matched the stain on her lips. Behind her, a couple I didn't know exchanged a quick glance, then looked away as if suddenly fascinated by the flower arrangements. I glanced past her, searching for my mother. Evelyn stood only a few steps behind Caroline, wearing a pale silk dress and the pearls I remembered from every holiday dinner. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes on mine for a brief moment before she shifted her gaze toward the fountain in the center of the courtyard. She didn't move, didn't say a word. She simply stood there beside Caroline, and that silence spoke louder than anything else. Heat rose in my chest, my pulse quickening in my ears. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to remind them of the years we had shared, of the nights I stayed up helping Dad with reports, of how I had once thought Caroline and I were on the same side. But the words tangled in my throat. Ethan stepped closer, his palm pressing lightly against the small of my back. His voice was low, just for me. "Hannah, not here. You don't owe them a scene." I swallowed hard, feeling the sting in my eyes, but I forced it back. Around us the murmurs had started. Someone coughed, and somewhere near the bar, a camera phone clicked. I could feel every glance on me, weighing and judging, turning the moment into a spectacle. Caroline's smile tilted just slightly, like she had won something. She took a slow sip of champagne, never breaking eye contact. The taste of humiliation settled bitter on my tongue. I shifted my grip on the album, the leather warm against my palms. My knuckles whitened as I steadied my breath. Without another word, I turned away from her, the movement deliberate. My heels clicked against the stone path, each step echoing louder in my ears than the music drifting from the string quartet. Ethan matched my pace, his hand hovering near mine. We walked past the manicured hedges toward the parking area, away from the arch, the chairs, the polite applause waiting for my parents' vows. I didn't look back. But as we reached the edge of the courtyard, I caught one last glimpse over my shoulder. My mother was still standing there, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, eyes fixed somewhere beyond me, as if I had never been there at all. The image carved itself into me sharp and permanent. I knew even as we stepped onto the sidewalk that it would be the thing I remembered most about today. Not the flowers, not the music, not even Carolyn's voice, but the way my mother chose silence. Ethan opened the passenger door for me, his eyes searching mine as if he could measure how close I was to breaking. I slid into the seat, the albums still clutched against me, and stared out the window as he started the engine. The car eased away from the curb, and the quiet hum of the tires on the pavement seemed too loud against the silence between us. My chest felt tight, like I was holding back something that would spill over if I let myself breathe too deeply. Downtown Denver slipped past in a blur of brick facades and blooming planters, but my mind wasn't here. It was already dragging me backward, pulling me into a memory I had spent years trying to keep sealed away. It was the spring of 2018, and I was standing in the glass-walled conference room at Mitchell Sterling Properties, sunlight reflecting off the polished table. I had spent months building the concept for the Riverside Lofts project, from architectural sketches to market analysis, pouring myself into every detail. The board meeting was supposed to be the final step before we broke ground. But when the agenda packet was handed out, my name was gone. In its place was Caroline's, listed as project lead. She sat across from me, legs crossed, smiling politely as she thanked the board for their trust. My father nodded in approval, as if the idea had always been hers. I remember gripping my pen so hard it left an imprint on my fingers, every word I wanted to say catching on the lump in my throat. When the meeting ended, she passed me in the hallway and murmured that it was nothing personal, just business. The memory burned, and before I could push it away, another came flooding in. 2 years later, the winter of 2020, the day of my grandfather's will reading. The room smelled faintly of coffee and wood polish, the heavy curtains drawn against the snow outside. I sat beside my younger brother Luke, who was tapping his foot nervously under the table. I still remember the way my stomach twisted when the attorney read through the list of bequests. Caroline's name came first, then my parents', then a few distant relatives. When he reached where my name should have been, he skipped over it entirely. I waited for him to circle back to correct himself, but he didn't. Luke's share was smaller than we had been told for years. It would be mine erased entirely. My mother kept her eyes on the polished surface of the table. My father leafed through the paperwork without a flicker of surprise. The attorney closed the file and wished everyone well, and that was it. Years of expectation gone in the space of a sentence. Luke muttered under his breath as we left the room, but I couldn't speak at all. It was as if someone had drawn a hard black line through my name and decided I no longer existed. I blinked back to the present, my gaze fixed on the Denver skyline as it receded behind us. The weight in my chest was heavier now, a chain of moments linked together, each one tightening until I could hardly breathe. Today's scene at the wedding wasn't an isolated cruelty. It was just the latest in a long line of cuts, some deep, some shallow, all in the same place. Ethan glanced at me at a red light. "I can see you're going somewhere in your head," he said quietly. I didn't answer right away. My fingers traced the edge of the album on my lap, feeling the embossed leather. "There's no point," I finally murmured. "They've made it clear what I am to them." He kept his eyes on the road, but his voice was steady. "Maybe. But you still have something they don't know you have." I turned toward him, not following at first. He gave me a quick look, the corner of his mouth tightening. "Those emails. The ones you showed me last year. The irregular transfers, the property write-offs that don't add up. You told me you kept copies." The air in the car seemed to shift sharper somehow. I had almost forgotten about the folder buried deep in my external drive, labeled under an innocuous project code. Back when I was still at the company, I had stumbled across a trail of suspicious financials. It wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping. It was calculated. Shell companies, inflated invoices, quiet asset transfers into accounts linked to my father and Caroline. I had taken screenshots, saved PDFs, thinking one day I might need them. Then I walked away thinking distance was my safest choice. I hesitated. Even if I did, what would it change? Ethan's hand stayed steady on the wheel, but his jaw tightened. "A lot, Hannah. It could level the playing field. Maybe even turn it in your favor." The idea lodged itself in my mind like a seed catching in soil. I looked out at the road ahead, the mountains faint in the distance. I had been so focused on surviving their cruelty that I had forgotten I wasn't empty-handed. The car slowed as we approached the intersection leading toward our hotel. Ethan's voice softened. You've spent years letting them decide your worth. Maybe it's time you show them you've been holding the real cards all along. I didn't answer, but my hand tightened around the album, the photos inside pressing against my palm like a silent reminder of what used to be. The thought of those files hidden but waiting began to burn a little brighter in the back of my mind. We turned into the hotel driveway, the stone archway ahead of us framed by climbing ivy. The valet stepped forward as we pulled up and Ethan cut the engine. I stepped out into the cool air, the faint scent of pine drifting in from the foothills, and for the first time that day I felt something other than hurt. It was quiet, but it was there, a slow, deliberate shift. I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do. But I knew I wasn't going to do nothing. The next morning, the rain had already started when we left Denver. By the time we pulled into Portland that evening, the city was draped in a soft mist, streetlights glowing like blurred halos. Ethan carried our bags in while I unlocked the apartment, the familiar creak of the door making something inside me unclench. Home always had a way of stripping away the noise, leaving only what mattered. I didn't bother taking off my coat. My steps went straight to the small storage closet off the hallway. Ethan watched from the kitchen as I pulled down a black lockbox from the top shelf. Inside was a silver external drive, smooth and cold in my hand. I hadn't touched it in years. My fingers hovered over it for a moment before I crossed to the desk in the corner and powered up my laptop. When the files opened, it was like stepping back into another life. Folder after folder labeled with dates from 2018 to 2021. Inside were scanned contracts, PDF invoices, email threads I had forwarded to myself late at night from my work account. I clicked one at random, a chain between Caroline and a contractor discussing a project site that didn't exist. The attached invoice listed charges for structural work on a warehouse in Tacoma, but the property records showed the lot had been vacant for over a decade. Another folder contained spreadsheets with totals in bold red cells. Over $6.2 million in transfers routed through 3 different shell corporations, all registered to a P.O. box in Arizona. Each company had a name generic enough to pass a casual glance, but I remembered the day I traced them back to accounts held by my father and Caroline. The memory sent a chill through me even now. Ethan came to stand behind me, resting one hand lightly on the back of my chair. You kept everything, he said, scanning the screen. Every invoice, every contract. I nodded without looking up. And every email I added. Enough to show a pattern that isn't just sloppy accounting. He leaned in a little, his voice low and deliberate. If this goes to the right place, the IRS will tear into it. It's not just fines, it could dismantle everything they've built their image on. I heard the weight in his tone, not just the promise of payback, but the warning that came with it. This wasn't gossip. This was the kind of thing that left a permanent mark. I sat back, the cursor blinking over a file name like it was waiting for me to decide. For years I had told myself I wanted nothing more to do with the Mitchell empire. But seeing it all here lined up and undeniable, I realized walking away had only given them more space to operate without question. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat beside me. You need someone who knows how to handle this, he said. Someone who can make sure you're protected while it all plays out. The name came to me instantly. Melissa Grant. She'd been a friend since college, sharp as glass and just as dangerous if you crossed her. She specialized in real estate law, but had a knack for pulling threads that others didn't see. I clicked through a few more files while Ethan fetched his phone. One email in particular made my pulse quicken. It was a forwarded thread from a Sterling Realty accountant questioning a large transfer to a vendor that didn't appear in the company's approved list. Caroline's reply was curt and final: handle it quietly. No further documentation. I could almost hear her voice as I read it, the cool dismissal that had ended more than one conversation between us. Ethan slid my phone across the desk. Call her, he said. Tonight. My thumb hesitated over the screen before I tapped her contact. It rang twice before her voice came through, warm but edged with curiosity. Hannah, I didn't expect to hear from you. I glanced at Ethan, who gave me a small nod. I think I have something you need to see, I told her. And I think it's going to require more than just your usual magic with contracts. There was a pause, then the rustle of papers on her end. How soon can you get here? She asked. I looked at the rain-streaked window, the city lights smeared against the glass. Tomorrow morning, I said. This isn't something I want to send over email. We ended the call and I shut down the laptop, the silver drive still warm from use. Ethan reached over and closed the lockbox, his hand covering mine for a moment before he set it aside. You're sure about this? He asked quietly. I was. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to what they had done to me. I was choosing my next move. The rain eased as the night went on, the sound soft against the windows. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the edges of every memory sharper now, as if pulling these files into the light had pulled me into focus too. Tomorrow would start something I couldn't take back. And that was exactly why I knew I had to see it through. By the time I stepped into the cafe, the air was thick with the smell of espresso and warm pastries. The place was tucked into a corner of downtown Denver, quiet enough for a real conversation, but busy enough that no one would pay much attention to us. Melissa was already there, sitting at a small table near the back, her hair pulled into a sleek ponytail and a leather folder in front of her. She stood as I approached, pulling me into a quick hug before we sat. Her eyes were sharp, assessing me in that way she always had when she was calculating her next move. I told her about the files, the invoices, the shell companies. She flipped open her folder and started jotting down notes, asking questions about dates and amounts without missing a beat. When I mentioned the P.O. box in Arizona, she stopped writing and looked up. That is the kind of thing the IRS loves to sink its teeth into, she said, tapping her pen against the paper. But we have to be precise. If this gets out before we have it airtight, they could spin it as a misunderstanding, and your family is very good at spinning. Ethan slid into the seat beside me with 2 coffees, setting one in front of me. He had been quiet until now, listening more than speaking. We need to think about timing, he said, glancing at Melissa. And the platform. If we drop this in the wrong way, they will have a chance to bury it before anyone with power sees it. Before Melissa could respond, a voice cut in from behind me. Is this about Sterling Realty? I turned and there was Luke standing with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. He looked older than I remembered from the last time we spoke, more worn around the eyes, but the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other was the same. He pulled out the chair across from me without asking and sat down. I heard about what happened at the wedding, he said, his tone careful. People are talking. I didn't want to believe it until I saw you here with them. His gaze flicked to Ethan and then Melissa. Melissa leaned back slightly, measuring him. Are you here to help or to warn us? She asked. Luke gave a small, humorless smile. That depends on how you define help. I know more than you think. I've seen transfers in the past 6 months that make the ones Hannah is talking about look like pocket change. But you know how it works. You speak up, you're out. And if you're out, you lose everything. Something in my chest tightened. You already lost a lot, I said. They cut your stake in the will. He nodded, looking down at the table. And I kept my mouth shut because I thought that was the price of survival. But maybe I was wrong. Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady. If you want out, this is your chance. We can do this clean. Melissa can handle the legal side. I can make sure the data is protected and verifiable. But we need someone inside. Luke looked at me, then really looked, and I could see the hesitation warring with something else. Resentment, maybe. Or a kind of quiet resolve. What would you need from me? He asked. Melissa closed her folder. Access to any current contracts, internal memos, vendor lists. And I mean unfiltered access. No one else can know you're pulling them. Luke's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. I can get them, he said. But if this blows back, I'm not taking the fall alone. You won't, I told him. None of us will. We sat there for a moment, the 3 of us letting the weight of what we had just agreed to settle over us. Outside, the traffic rolled past, the world moving on as if nothing had shifted, but I could feel it. The ground had tilted. Luke reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flash drive, sliding it across the table toward me. This is a start, he said, Recent vendor payments, unapproved expenses. Enough to get your IRS friends interested. I glanced at Ethan, who was already tucking it into his laptop bag. Melissa stood gathering her things. We move fast, she said. The longer this sits, the more time they have to cover their tracks. Luke stayed seated watching her leave, then turned back to me. You know this is going to burn everything down, right? I met his eyes. That's the point. Ethan finished his coffee and pushed back his chair. Let's get home and start sorting through this. We've got work to do. As we stepped out into the cool afternoon, the wind carried the scent of rain again, sharp and clean. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting to what they'd done. I was building something that could finally end it. By the time we reached my apartment, the clouds had thickened over the Portland skyline, turning the late afternoon light into a muted silver wash. The familiar creak of the hallway floorboards under our feet felt almost amplified, like the whole building was holding its breath. Inside, I dropped my bag on the kitchen counter and went straight for the small closet where I kept the portable whiteboard. If we were going to do this, I needed to see it all in front of me step by step, without the blur of emotion clouding it. Ethan had already set up his laptop on the coffee table by the time I came back with the whiteboard and a stack of sticky notes. He had Luke's flash drive plugged in, the screen filling with rows of folders marked by dates and obscure project codes. Some of the names triggered a memory right away: Westbrook Towers, Red Maple Residences, and a handful of shell LLCs I had once seen buried deep in budget spreadsheets. Others I didn't recognize, but the dates aligned perfectly with the years I'd been cut out of major deals. I set the board down and clicked the cap off a marker. We need 3 phases, I said, writing the numbers 1, 2, and 3-inch clean black strokes. First, verify every piece of data. No missing links, no guessing. Ethan nodded without looking up from the screen. Second, decide the release method so it hits hard and can't be smothered. And third, I added, anticipate the counterattack. PR, spin, legal threats, even personal smear campaigns. The last part made my stomach knot, but saying it out loud was better than pretending it wouldn't happen. Melissa had already texted me a list of 2 forensic accountants she trusted implicitly, people with a reputation for airtight reports and zero tolerance for intimidation. I wrote their names in the first column. Ethan began opening files one by one, reading quickly, then flagging them with a color-coded system: red for direct evidence of fraud, yellow for circumstantial support, blue for documents that would corroborate timelines. The clicking of the mouse and the quiet scratch of my marker on the board became a kind of rhythm, keeping us both focused. After a while, he looked up and asked quietly, "Why now, Hannah? What's the real line they crossed this time?" I paused, my gaze falling on the name Caroline scrawled in the corner of the board. "It's not just what happened at the wedding," I said. "It's everything. 2018 Westbrook Towers, my project, my work, and they gave it to her. Then the will in 2020 when my name disappeared like I'd never existed. And now standing there while she said I wasn't family with my mother, just watching. It's like they've been rewriting this story for years and I've been letting them." Ethan leaned back, folding his arms. "So this isn't only about justice for the fraud. It's about reclaiming your place in the truth." "Yes," I said more firmly than I expected. "They erased me from the business, the family, and the future they were building. This is me refusing to vanish." The fear I'd been pushing down all day rose again in my chest. What if they go after me with everything they have: legal teams, media connections, lies I can't disprove fast enough? He didn't hesitate. "Then you face them head on. Or you stay silent and give them the ending they want. But if you want your name, your value, your truth back, you take the shot." His words settled over me like a slow, steady drumbeat. I turned back to the board and under phase 2 wrote in block letters, "Release date." We checked the calendar together. Sterling Realty's annual gala was 3 weeks away, a glittering evening packed with donors, clients, and journalists who would eat up a scandal like it was champagne. "Perfect," Ethan said. "High visibility, high pressure. They'll be surrounded by the very people they don't want knowing any of this." We decided the release would happen in 3 waves. First, an anonymous tip to two investigative journalists. Melissa knew personally people who wouldn't run the story without solid proof, but who wouldn't back down either. Second, a timed document drop to an encrypted public archive with international mirrors making it impossible to delete. And third, a quiet push to certain industry contacts who would ensure Sterling Realty's deals started to dry up within days. As I wrote each step on the board, the fear didn't vanish, but it transformed into something sharper, more controlled. This wasn't about revenge for the sake of revenge. This was about precision, about making sure the truth cut exactly where it needed to. Ethan closed the laptop and came to stand beside me, his hand brushing mine as he took the marker. In the final column labeled Phase 3, he wrote 2 words in neat, deliberate strokes: control narrative. They'll try to tell their version, he said. We make sure yours comes first and is backed by facts so strong they can't bury it. We worked until the city outside turned from silver to black, streetlights casting long shadows across the living room. My shoulders ached from leaning over the board, but for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next hit. I was the one setting the timeline, and every move we planned felt like reclaiming something I'd thought was lost forever. When Ethan finally set the marker down, the whiteboard was crowded with plans, names, and arrows linking each step. It was messy, but it was ours. The air felt charged like the pause before a storm, and I knew that from this point on nothing about my family or me would ever be the same again. Luke told me later that after I walked out of the garden that afternoon, the energy around the reception shifted in a way you could almost feel in your bones. The music kept playing, the champagne kept flowing, but there was a subtle ripple under it all, a tightening in the air. A few people at his table leaned in, whispering about what they had just witnessed. One woman from the local arts council asked if he had seen the look on my face when Caroline stopped me. Another man, a retired banker, muttered something about not a good look for a family in their position before glancing around to make sure no one important was within earshot. Melissa, who had been seated closer to the main table, noticed the way heads turned every time Caroline crossed the room. She kept her smile in place, glass of white wine in hand, but her eyes were darting just a little too much, scanning for who might be watching. The photographer had been circling the tables for candids, yet Melissa saw him hesitate when he reached Caroline's side, as if even he could sense the veneer cracking. Toward the back of the garden, under the shade of a white tent, Luke overheard a conversation between 2 men in tailored suits. One of them, a tall man with silver hair, was David Langford's former law partner. His voice was low, but the words carried. I heard Sterling's cash flow isn't as clean as they like to pretend. Something about a project in Rivergate with a ghost investor. If it's true, it won't end well. The other man gave a short laugh, the kind people use when they want to appear in on the joke but are still unsure of the punchline. Luke told me he felt something click in that moment. Not proof, not yet, but the kind of smoke that told him there was a fire worth finding. He glanced toward Caroline, who was now in a circle of city officials, her laugh a little too loud, her gestures a shade too sharp. Even from across the lawn, he could see the faint line forming between her brows. Melissa noticed it too. When the toast began, Evelyn and Richard stood together at the microphone, their practiced warmth wrapping the crowd in nostalgia and polished anecdotes. But Melissa caught the way Richard's eyes slid toward his eldest daughter, almost like he was measuring her, checking for something beneath the surface. Caroline clapped at the right moments, raised her glass at the right cues, but the tension in her shoulders never loosened. After the toasts, as the band started playing a softer set, Melissa excused herself to the ladies' room. On the way back, she passed a pair of women by the dessert table. One of them, a developer Melissa recognized from a Sterling Realty ribbon cutting last year, was saying quietly, if the rumors are true, this could tank her next bid. The city won't touch anything tied to a scandal. The other woman gave a small shrug, but her gaze followed Caroline as she moved through the crowd. Luke stayed until the cake was cut, partly out of obligation, partly to see if the mood would settle. It didn't. Every so often, he caught a flicker of someone checking their phone mid-conversation, their expression tightening for just a second before they slipped back into polite small talk. He didn't know what they were reading, but he knew it wasn't the kind of thing you ignored. By the time the band wrapped their second set, Caroline's laugh had dropped an octave and her smile had begun to falter at the edges. Luke described it as watching a vase with a hairline crack. You couldn't see it shatter yet, but you knew one wrong touch would do it. Melissa left just before sunset, noting how the air had cooled and how the clusters of guests seemed smaller, more inward-facing. When she walked past the valet stand, she heard someone mutter, "Shame really." Beautiful event in the kind of tone that meant they were talking about more than just the flowers and lighting. That night, when Luke called me, his voice carried that same undercurrent. "You didn't see it, Hannah, but you started something when you left. People noticed. And some of them are already talking." I sat on the edge of my couch, the phone warm against my ear, feeling the pieces align in my mind. The damage wasn't visible yet, but the foundation had shifted. All we had to do was keep pushing. Ethan set the laptop on the dining table and angled the screen toward me. Everything's organized into 3 folders: financial records, internal communications, and project files. No filler, no duplicates. Melissa's voice came through on speaker steady but clipped as if she was holding the weight of the moment in her jaw. "Once you hit send, this is out of your hands. Angela's already cleared time with her editor. David Langford will see the files within the hour." I scrolled through the list of attachments, the lines of dates and amounts like a trail of breadcrumbs that led straight to Caroline. The contracts for Rivergate were there, each one stamped and signed with the shell company's name appearing in just the right places to make it look legitimate. Ethan had highlighted the transaction totals, numbers that looked clean on the surface but cross-referenced with the project's actual budget left a black hole worth millions. Melissa had been blunt earlier in the call. "The IRS won't ignore this. Not if it's presented properly. Angela will know how to frame it without giving Caroline room to spin it as a misunderstanding." I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the trackpad. "Once we do this, she'll know it was me." "She already suspects," Ethan said. He sat across from me, his elbows on the table, eyes fixed on mine. "The difference is after this she won't be able to touch you without touching the whole mess. That's your shield." Melissa cut in. "And David Langford has more to lose than you. Once he realizes he's been tied to fraudulent deals, he'll turn that fury straight at her. He's not the type to take embarrassment quietly." The name alone was enough to make my pulse quicken. David Langford had been one of Sterling Realty's biggest private backers for over a decade. His presence at any event was both a signal of prestige and a silent warning to anyone thinking of challenging the company's influence. If he felt betrayed, the fallout wouldn't just be financial, it would be social, political, all the things Caroline valued most. I opened my email, addressed the files to Angela's encrypted account, copied Melissa, and added David's private address, the one Luke had confirmed through a quiet favor from a friend in banking. The subject line was short: Sterling Realty Records. Ethan's hand rested on the back of my chair. "You're ready." I hit send. The confirmation box popped up, the bar inching forward until it was done. It was such a small action for something so irreversible. Angela called less than 10 minutes later. Her voice was brisk, businesslike, but I could hear the spark in it. "I've gone through enough to know this is real. I'll have my fact-checkers pull property records and corporate filings, but I don't expect anything to fall apart in verification. We're aiming for a coordinated release at 7 p.m. Friday. You'll want to be somewhere you can watch it happen." "Friday," I repeated, glancing at Ethan. Melissa's voice returned to the line. "That's the night of Sterling Realty's annual gala. Every investor, city official, and contractor who matters will be in one room. Caroline won't be able to hide from it." Angela added, "If Langford confronts her in person, it'll be the first thing anyone remembers about the night." The image came unbidden. Caroline, in one of her flawless gowns, smile fixed, while David Langford leaned in, voice low but cutting the cameras, catching every angle. After we hung up, Ethan poured 2 glasses of water and set one in front of me. "No champagne yet. You're going to need a clear head." I sipped, my mind already running through what Friday would look like. Melissa would attend as an invited guest of a council member she knew. Luke had managed to get a ticket through one of his old colleagues. Ethan and I would stay off-site, monitoring the social feeds, ready to push the story wider if it hit resistance. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Melissa texted an update. Langford had replied to the email. He'd read every attachment and sent back 4 words: "We will discuss Friday." Ethan read it over my shoulder and let out a low whistle. That's not a warning, that's a promise. I stared at the words, a strange mix of relief and apprehension settling over me. For years, I had been on the receiving end of their decisions, their silences, their cuts. Now, for the first time, something was moving in my direction. Before we turned in for the night, Melissa called once more, her tone softer. Hannah, after Friday, you can't predict the shape this will take. But you'll have shifted the balance. That's the point. You're not powerless anymore. I hung up and looked out at the city lights blinking against the dark. The air felt still waiting. Somewhere inside that quiet, I felt it too, the line we had just crossed, the one you couldn't come back from even if you wanted to. From the mezzanine level of the hotel's grand ballroom, I had a clear view of the stage and the rows of glittering tables below. Crystal chandeliers poured warm light over the guests, catching on sequined gowns and polished cufflinks. The sound of cutlery against china faded as Caroline stepped up to the podium, her smile as precise as the sweep of her hair. She thanked the board, the investors, the city officials in attendance, her voice carrying easily over the hushed room. Cameras from the local press lined the back wall, and I saw more than one guest lift a phone discreetly. At our table near the railing, Melissa leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on the far corner where David Langford sat still and watchful. Caroline launched into the company's latest achievements, weaving in anecdotes meant to charm. That was when David rose. The movement alone drew eyes. His chair scraped back loud in the quiet. Without waiting for acknowledgement, he spoke, his voice deep and cutting. Caroline, before you go on about Sterling's growth, perhaps you can clarify why $6.2 million was routed through a shell company last year. The shift in the room was immediate. A ripple of whispers broke across the tables. A woman in emerald silk glanced sharply at the man beside her, who was already pulling out his phone. Caroline froze, her hand gripping the podium. David, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time, he interrupted, his gaze locked on her. You took that money from a project you claimed was over budget. Yet the project's ledgers, which I now have, tell a different story. Would you like me to read them aloud? Gasps scattered through the room. A man in a gray suit near the front stood and walked toward the exit, phone pressed to his ear. Two others bent toward each other, their faces tight. From my vantage point, I could see Caroline's jaw working. She tried to smooth her voice. If you have concerns, we can address them privately. Angela's timing was perfect. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I glanced down to see her post go live, a headline in bold, the key documents attached, the hashtag number, Sterling Realty scandal already climbing. Within seconds, the guests' phones began lighting up. A low hum filled the room as people scrolled, eyebrows rising, mouths tightening. David stepped closer to the stage, ignoring the event staff who tried to intercept him. Private won't cut it anymore, Caroline. Not after you've tied my name to fraud. She raised her voice, the controlled polish cracking. That's a serious accusation, and you know nothing about the complexities of $6.2 million isn't a complexity. It's theft, David shot back. The word seemed to hang in the air. Someone in the crowd lifted their phone higher, recording openly now. I caught a glimpse of the red recording dot from across the room. Melissa's hand brushed mine under the table, the smallest acknowledgement that the moment we'd worked toward had arrived. Caroline's voice climbed, brittle with anger. If you think you can undermine me with baseless claims, you're mistaken. David didn't flinch. The only mistake was trusting you. The room had shifted fully against her. Conversations flared in pockets, some guests standing to leave, others typing furiously. A city official in the third row leaned toward his aide, whispering urgently. Near the stage, a young man in a tux stepped forward with his phone extended, capturing Caroline's glare as she snapped. Turn that off or I'll have you removed. It was too late. The clip was already on its way to dozens of feeds. I felt my own phone buzz again, this time with a notification showing the video had been shared over 100 times in under 5 minutes. Caroline turned away from David, searching for someone in the crowd to back her, but the support she was used to wasn't there. Faces she'd counted on were turned down to screens or angled toward exits. Melissa exhaled slowly beside me. It's over, she murmured, though the night was far from finished. Ethan, who had been quiet until then, leaned closer. The cameras caught every word. She can't talk her way out of this. I kept my eyes on the stage as Caroline stepped back from the podium, her smile gone entirely now. She said something sharp to an assistant who hurried off toward the side doors. David returned to his seat without another glance at her, his expression unreadable but satisfied. The event's MC stumbled through an attempt to redirect the program, but the energy had shifted beyond repair. More guests left their footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. In the background, Angela's post continued to spread, the hashtag flashing on my screen alongside clips from multiple angles. The scandal had legs now, and it was running. I sat back, letting the hum of voices and the click of heels on marble wash over me. We had set the match, and now the fire was moving on its own. The meeting room at Sterling Realty's downtown office still smelled faintly of champagne from the reception hall, as if the night's chaos had followed them here. The heavy glass doors were shut, muting the city noise, and every person around the long walnut table looked drawn and tired. Carolyn sat at the head, a glass of water in front of her that she hadn't touched, her nails tapping a restless rhythm on the wood. "This was sabotage," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. "Someone fed that garbage to Langford, and I guarantee it wasn't anyone in this family. It had to come from outside." Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "The Langford contract isn't our only problem. We've got 3 other deals hanging in the balance, and after tonight they'll all want to renegotiate. If we can't prove this is fake, we're looking at millions in losses." Evelyn sat across from him, her posture rigid, eyes cold. "Do you have any idea how humiliating it was for me to stand there while half of Denver watched our family name drag through the mud? I could feel people staring, wondering if I knew. I have spent years rebuilding our reputation after the divorce, and in one night you've set us back a decade." Caroline's mouth twisted. "You think this was my fault? I have been carrying this company since Dad stepped down." "If someone planted false documents," Luke, seated halfway down the table, let out a low laugh. "False? That's what you're going with? You really expect us to believe the numbers aren't real?" Her eyes snapped to him. "You're out of line." "No," he said, his voice steady. "What's out of line is pretending this is just about one night. This is how our family operates. Anyone who threatens the control you cling to gets pushed out." Evelyn's gaze narrowed. "Luke, this is not the time." "It's exactly the time," he said, leaning forward. "You erased Hannah from the inheritance without blinking. Dad, you cut me out of the Sterling Place project even though I was the one who brought in the zoning approvals. You've done it to others too, all so you can keep everything in a neat little circle where only the 3 of you hold the power. Well, look around. That circle is collapsing." Caroline slammed her palm on the table. "You have no idea what it takes to run this company. Loyalty matters." Luke's laugh was short and bitter. "Loyalty? You mean silence? You've confused the two for so long you don't know the difference anymore." Richard's voice rose, the edge of panic in it. "If you're going to make accusations, you'd better be ready to back them up in court. Right now we need unity, not..." "I'm done," Luke said, cutting him off. "I'm done pretending we're united. After tonight, the only thing I want is distance. I'm resigning from the board effective immediately. And before you ask, no, I don't want a cent from the trust. Keep your rotten legacy." Evelyn's hand twitched toward him, a reflex, but she let it fall. "You're making a mistake." "No," Luke said quietly. "The mistake was thinking I could change anything from inside." He pushed his chair back, the scrape loud in the tense room. Caroline stared at him, her face pale now, as if the reality of losing an insider had only just landed. "You walk away now, you're siding with whoever's trying to destroy us." Luke paused at the doorway. "Maybe they're not trying to destroy you. Maybe they're just giving the world a clear view of what you really are." He left without another word, the door clicking shut behind him. For a moment, no one spoke. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. Richard rubbed his temples, muttering about calling the legal team. Evelyn sat back, her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes fixed on the far wall. Caroline finally lifted her water glass and took a long drink, though her hand trembled slightly as she set it down again. I watched them from my seat against the wall, unnoticed in the swirl of their own crisis. Luke had just taken the first public step any of us had dared to make from within, and the fracture it left behind was wider than they wanted to admit. Somewhere outside, the faint hum of the city went on, oblivious to the implosion in this room. I knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. The ripple had started, and it was already moving outward. The knock at my door was deliberate, almost rehearsed, the kind that tells you the people on the other side came not to visit but to negotiate a surrender. Ethan looked up from the dining table where he was reviewing a spreadsheet, his brow tightening. I crossed the living room without saying a word, every step steady despite the heat prickling at the back of my neck. When I opened the door, Richard stood in front, his suit impeccable as if he had walked out of a boardroom. Evelyn was next to him, her silk scarf still looped around her neck like a shield. Caroline trailed behind, phone in hand, eyes sweeping over my apartment in one fast assessing glance before locking on me. They didn't wait to be invited in. Richard stepped forward, his voice clipped. "We need to talk. Now." Ethan rose from the table but stayed silent, positioning himself at my side. Luke was already in the armchair near the window, having come over earlier to help with the media plan. His expression didn't change, but I saw the way his shoulders stiffened. Caroline's heels clicked on the hardwood as she stopped just short of the coffee table, her gaze flicking to the organized stacks of files, labeled folders, and a laptop open to an email draft. "You've made a mess," she said flatly. "And you're going to clean it up." I stayed near the door, forcing them to do the moving. "That depends on what you think the mess is. The truth or the fact that it's finally public." Richard's jaw worked. "The problem is that you've dragged family business into the street. That's not how we handle things." Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh. "Seems to me that how you handle things is exactly why we're here." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice softer but laced with urgency. "Hannah, please. This doesn't have to go any further. If you pull the information back, we can make things right. You and Luke will be included in the trust again. We'll formalize it. You'll have your share guaranteed." Luke shifted in his chair, the corner of his mouth twitching in something close to disbelief. "That's rich. You cut us out without a second thought, but now that the walls are cracking, we're suddenly part of the family again." Caroline ignored him, her tone sharpening. "If you don't stop this, we will take you to court. Defamation. Breach of fiduciary duty. Interference with contractual relationships. You'll lose years of your life fighting us, and it will drain every dollar you have." I moved toward the coffee table, placing a hand on the stack of evidence without breaking eye contact. "Then I guess we'll see how discovery goes. I'm sure the IRS and a judge will love to read about those wire transfers." Richard's voice hardened. "This is your last warning. We are offering you a way out, Hannah. Walk away from this and we can rebuild. Keep pushing and you'll regret it." Evelyn's eyes searched mine, her face drawn. "I don't want to lose you. I don't want this to be permanent." I thought of her standing in that garden 2 weeks ago, silent, while Caroline declared me no longer family. "You already lost me. You just didn't notice until it hurt you." Caroline's temper slipped, her voice rising. "You think you're a hero. You're nothing but a bitter little girl with a grudge." Ethan stepped in, then his presence solid beside me. "She's someone who's done what you were too arrogant to believe possible. She's exposed you. And she's not alone." Luke stood, moving to my other side. "Whatever happens next, I'm in this. I won't be part of a legacy built on lies." For a moment the room was silent except for the steady patter of rain against the windows. Richard looked at each of us, calculating his expression, a mix of anger and something else, maybe recognition that the balance had shifted for good. Finally, he turned toward the door. "You're making a mistake." Caroline's glare lingered on me, her heels striking the floor in sharp beats as she followed him out. Evelyn paused at the threshold, her lips parting as if to say something, then closing again. She stepped into the hallway without looking back. The door clicked shut, and the air in the apartment seemed to exhale. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, glancing toward the evidence spread across the table. "They're desperate. That means we're close." Luke let out a slow breath and dropped back into the armchair. "They're not going to stop coming at you. But neither am I." I gathered the nearest folder, feeling the weight of it in my hands. The rain outside was unrelenting, a steady drumbeat that made the moment feel suspended as if the world was holding its breath. For the first time since this started, I felt the quiet certainty settle in. They had come here to scare me into silence. All they had done was remind me exactly why I wouldn't be. The first letter from the IRS came in early spring, its plain white envelope almost understated for what it carried. By the time the investigation became public, it was no longer just a rumor whispered in boardrooms. It was on the front page of the Denver Post, splashed across financial blogs, and discussed in hushed, disbelieving tones at every networking event in the city. Caroline's name was in the headline, followed by words she had spent her entire career avoiding: federal inquiry, misappropriated funds penalty. The fines hit first. $1.5 million in civil penalties due before the end of the fiscal quarter. Her lawyer's statement to the press tried to frame it as an accounting oversight, but it was clear to anyone who had read the IRS findings that the story was much uglier. The sale of her vacation property in Aspen followed weeks later. It had been her sanctuary, a glass-walled retreat overlooking the slopes, the place she paraded on social media every winter. Watching the listing go live on Zillow felt like watching the first stone come loose from a crumbling wall. Sterling Realty took the next blow. The stock price slid more than 40% in 6 weeks as key clients pulled out, citing instability in leadership. Two of the firm's biggest commercial accounts quietly moved their portfolios to competitors. Luke kept me updated, his tone flat but his eyes betraying something between satisfaction and disbelief. For years he had watched them bend the truth until it snapped. Now the recoil was breaking bones. On a more personal front, the fallout was almost cinematic in its cruelty. Caroline's partner of 8 years packed his belongings and moved out within a month of the scandal going public. The split wasn't amicable. Rumors swirled about heated arguments, accusations, and the quiet but telling fact that he took their shared dog with him. I didn't celebrate it, but I also didn't mourn for her. It wasn't the loss itself that mattered, it was what it revealed. Without the shield of her title and reputation, she was just another person people decided they could live without. Richard and Evelyn's decline was slower but no less certain. Invitations to galas and charity dinners stopped arriving. Their names disappeared from the donors list at the Denver Arts Council. At a spring fundraiser I attended with Melissa, I overheard someone refer to them as socially radioactive. It was a phrase that would have made me laugh if it hadn't been so devastatingly accurate. They tried once to bridge the gap. The email from my father arrived late one Friday night, almost as if he hoped I wouldn't see it until the weekend dulled my resolve. He wrote about rebuilding, about learning from mistakes, about how families could heal. Evelyn called 2 days later, her voice warm but tentative, asking if we could meet for lunch. There was no apology in her words, only an assumption that the years of silence and betrayal could be erased if I agreed to step back into the fold. I didn't respond to the email. When Evelyn called again, I told her I was grateful for the thought, but I had no interest in rejoining the family's orbit. "I wish you well," I said, and I meant it. But my life no longer revolved around the Mitchell name. By then, the company Luke and I had launched with Ethan was gaining momentum. We had started small, focusing on boutique property development in Portland, but the publicity from the Sterling Realty scandal brought an unexpected wave of interest. Investors who had once ignored my proposals were now asking for meetings. Clients who wanted ethical, transparent partnerships found us on their own. We grew carefully, deliberately choosing projects that matched our vision rather than chasing scale for its own sake. In the quiet moments, I sometimes thought about what would have happened if I had taken their deal, if I had walked away from the evidence in exchange for a restored place in the trust. The answer was always the same. I would have been back in the same cage, gilded maybe, but still a cage. Now, every decision was mine. Every success mine. Every failure too, but I could live with that. One afternoon in late May, Luke stopped by the office with a box of old files he had finally cleared out from his condo. "Last pieces of Sterling Realty I had lying around," he said, dropping the box on my desk. Inside were printed floor plans, outdated marketing materials, and a few framed photos from company events. At the bottom was a brass nameplate: Luke Mitchell, VP Operations. He held it for a moment before setting it down. "You keeping it?" I asked. He shook his head. No point. That guy doesn't exist anymore. I understood exactly what he meant. I felt it too. The morning light spilled across the white oak table in our new Portland office, catching on the rim of my coffee mug, and the edge of the blueprint spread open in front of me. Outside, the street was still damp from an early rain, the smell of wet pavement drifting in through the slightly open window. Ethan was already up at the whiteboard, sleeves rolled to his elbows, sketching out a timeline in thick blue marker. Luke sat at the far end of the table, leaning over a stack of contracts with the easy focus of someone who had finally found work worth doing. It still felt strange sometimes, walking into a space that belonged to us where every choice, the furniture, the projects, the people had been made without anyone else's permission. The exposed brick walls were lined with shelves of binders, each neatly labeled, and a single framed photograph hung behind my desk. The three of us on the day we signed our first client. That client, David Langford, was sitting across from me now, his reading glasses perched low as he reviewed the preliminary proposal for a waterfront redevelopment. His pen tapped once against the paper before he set it down. "This is solid," he said. "Transparent, efficient, and with room for the kind of community growth I've been wanting to see for years." Hearing that from him, someone who had once been so closely tied to Sterling Realty, meant more than I let on. After the scandal, David had walked away from Caroline and the company, determined to rebuild his investments with people he could trust. He could have chosen anyone, but he called us. That choice was its own kind of vindication. Luke outlined the zoning timeline while Ethan pulled up a 3D rendering of the mixed-use layout. I watched them work together, noticing how easily they trusted one another's instincts. It was something I had never seen in the boardroom back at Sterling Realty, where every suggestion was a test and every agreement a temporary truce. By midday, the rain had cleared and sunlight slanted through the tall windows, warming the wood floors. We broke for lunch at the long reclaimed wood table, a centerpiece we'd chosen instead of cubicles. Luke leaned back, balancing his chair on two legs. "You ever think about how quickly this came together once we stopped waiting for their approval?" I smiled because I had thought about it almost every day. For years, we'd been holding our breath, circling the same walls, hoping for an opening that was never going to come. The moment we stopped asking, the doors opened in every direction. Sterling Realty was still there, but barely. The staff cuts had gutted their operations. Their once glossy PR machine was quiet, reduced to small, cautious press releases that said little and promised less. Caroline had vanished from public view, and word had it she sold the vacation lodge she loved so much to cover her IRS penalties. Richard and Evelyn kept to themselves, their social invitations drying up along with their influence. The difference in my own life was sharper than I expected. The constant hum of tension was gone. I no longer woke up with the weight of defending myself before I had even spoken. In its place was something steadier, quieter, a kind of pride that didn't need an audience. That afternoon, David stayed to review some final figures. We gathered around the whiteboard again, making small adjustments to the phasing plan. At one point, Ethan glanced at me over the marker in his hand. "You know," he said, "this feels like the start of something big. Not just for us, but for everyone who gets pulled into the projects we're building." I nodded. "That's the point. We're not just taking deals for the profit margins, we're building something that lasts." Luke grinned at that. "And something they'll never be able to touch." As the day wound down, I found myself standing at the window, watching the late light turn the city gold. Portland had a pulse I could feel now, a kind of forward motion I had never found in Denver. It wasn't about the skyline or the market size, it was about belonging somewhere that didn't ask me to cut away parts of myself to fit. When the last contract was signed and the files were tucked neatly into their place, Luke slid the folder across the table to me. "This one's ours," he said. Ethan handed me a pen without a word. I signed my name slowly, the letters flowing without hesitation. The satisfaction wasn't sharp or triumphant. It was deeper than that, rooted in the knowledge that every step here had been my choice. No one could erase it, no matter how many names they crossed out of a will or how many meetings they shut me out of. Before we left, I took one last look around the office. The shelves, the table, the clean whiteboard, it was all a reminder that worth isn't inherited, it's built. And the only people who can truly define your value are the ones who see you clearly and still choose to stand beside you. If you've ever been told you don't belong or that your worth depends on someone else's permission, remember this. You can walk away. You can start over. And you can build something so strong that no one can take it from you. If my story has struck a chord, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe so we can keep telling these stories together. Because there is strength in knowing you are not alone.